right, welcome to Ideology. Mick Murray here with Drew Stedman. Got AJ behind the camera. And if you were with us last week, we talked about the fact that we're going to be jumping into a book study, James K.A. Smith's book, How Not to Be Secular. And we're going to be talking about the intro today, as this podcast releases on the 15th, if you're following this in real time. We'll do a chapter or two a week after that. We'll look at chapter 1, January 22nd. Chapters 2 and 3 on the 29th, and then chapters 4 and 5 on February 5th. For those of you who want to stay up to date, and of course, you can delay listening to these episodes to give you some time to read the book. But like Drew mentioned last week, we might be doing a live event. We're still talking about that. Feel free to email us at ideologypc@gmail.com to indicate interest in doing something like that to help us to gauge how to engage this content with you. We want to make
this potluck.
Could be a potluck, yeah. Hey, if we're here in Waco, we could bring some food, sit down, and just hash it out. We're doing this because we want this to be helpful. We don't just like listening to ourselves talk. We found these topics to be helpful in our own lives, and so I want to unpack this in a meaningful way. So let us know how that could be engaged in possibly a live setting. So with that, James K.A. Smith. Drew, why don't you tee up the intro of the book, How Not to Be Secular?
Thanks, Mick. We're going to do three things today. I want to give an overview of James K. Smith and where he's coming from. So I've read quite a bit of his material. This book is really about Charles Taylor more than it is James Smith, in the sense that he is reviewing Taylor's book, A Secular Age. And really, I'm almost finished with the book, and he tracks very closely with Taylor. And so, I'll introduce Taylor as well and the congruency between those two guys, and you'll probably see pretty quickly why Smith likes him so much. And for a bonus feature for ideology listeners, if you've been around a while, you can see the influence of my own thought from these two guys as well. And then lastly, I'm going to give three key concepts that come from the intro that I think are critical to understand the book. So today, it's going to be better if you haven't yet started reading, because hopefully we can explain some of these concepts. And then as you read it, you'll come across some of these terms. And Smith does a good job explaining it, but sometimes it's helpful just to have somebody else unpack it a little bit. And then that unlocks a lot of the critical concepts. So that's the goal today. So let's start with Jamie Smith. He is Pentecostal Reformed.
Did you just call him Jamie Smith?
Yeah, he goes by that too.
Oh, okay. Just want to make sure I heard you correctly.
A lot of these guys, it's like...
You're in close with them?
No, it's how they get referred to.
Yes.
You could be like M. What's your middle name, Mick?
Robert.
Ooh, M.R. Murray. That's like your author name, but then you're Mick, and then Mickey. Sure. I don't know. Yeah. Probably not that one.
Not recently.
So
it's okay. Jamie Smith.
James K. Smith. He's Pentecostal, Reformed, liturgical, and pretty postmodern.
Okay.
Which is a great combination. And as surprising as that may seem, he's not the only one. Like there's definitely a strand, especially among Pentecostal scholars, that incorporate at least some of those elements together. And you can kind of see here as I walk through some of what he tries to do, you can kind of see why he does these things. And so I'm going to start with Reformed, and in particular, I'm going to look at Reformed epistemology. And this is different than Reformed theology, though I think Smith is a blend of both. A key guy with this is Alvin Plantinga, and he is a philosopher of religion. I don't know if I'd call his work apologetic. It's not apologetic per se, but he's demonstrating the coherence or the viability of Christian thought. And it's called Reformed epistemology because a lot of the central thinkers with it were Reformed, although not all of them. Another guy, William Alston, was Church of England and not Reformed, another key guy. But it was a movement that, it still goes on, but, last 30, 40 years. So Plantinga, and James K. Smith quotes him in some of his other books, he has this idea that is really central, is that we have a right to do Christian theology or philosophy from Christian commitments. And what he's saying there is we don't owe it to a supposedly secular, neutral belief system, that our philosophizing and theologizing has to start in some other belief system. So in other words, I can take the central commitments of my Christian heritage and from within that, then build a theological and philosophical system. I don't owe it to somebody else to reconcile my commitments to their commitments. And that unlocks a lot, because then all of a sudden I'm not having to start with maybe a naturalistic or, somebody who's like an atheist, this world is all there is. I don't have to go to them and demonstrate how what I'm trying to say can fit with what they've already accepted. I can just say, well, that's your way of looking at the world. I have a different way of looking at the world. And I'm building out logical coherence from within my own system without the demand of that having to correlate to somebody else's system.
So maybe you could do that missiologically, like you can contextualize and get into somebody else's shoes, but you're saying epistemologically it's not necessary in order to build out the coherence of a system.
Exactly. And there's a concept of warranted and justified belief. So warranted belief is if somebody is in their right mind and they come to a belief and for whatever reason, that's warranted. Like that's legit. It's logical. It's not a hallucination, as far as we know. And I believe something. Justification, it occurs when that belief is challenged in some way. If I'm able to, on the back end of that challenge, demonstrate, no, this is still a logical belief. And so coherence is the key concept there and typically coherence is an internal concept. So, if I'm saying one thing about God and then I contradict myself in the next sentence of what I'm trying to say about God, there's an internal contradiction in what I'm trying to say. But if I can demonstrate internal coherence from within a warranted belief, and so in our case, it could be the traditions of the Christian church that have been passed down throughout history. That's warranted. Like we have plenty of justifiable reasons. I mean, that's actually getting into justification, but that's warranted that I would believe that and accept that's been passed down. Now it's challenged. Okay, so it's challenged by modern science or modern philosophy or whatever. So it's challenged, but it's justified not because I've answered everybody's objections, but I can demonstrate that my belief system remains logically coherent on its own terms.
Does there have to be any kind of correspondence to reality that's demonstrated?
Every belief system, and this really tees up a secular age, is every belief system is trying to correspond to reality. And so yes, on the one hand, how you make sense of that reality needs to be coherent. But if somebody in another belief system is trying to set the playing field by saying, well, science proves this, and especially if what they're saying about science is not actual science, or even what is science, like all of those are social constructs to some extent. And so I don't owe it to those people that I come onto their playing field. And so I can incorporate data, obviously if I am, like I'll say, if I'm committed to the belief that the earth is flat, at some point, the reality of the world around me is I'm going to run into a lot of problems with that kind of belief. And so, the experience of the world around me is going to invalidate that at one level. But there's other things of like what is supernatural is a very contested question that does spill over into the book we're about to read. And, and there's all types of assumptions like, is this world this closed causal system where it's kind of as you might imagine with kind of a modernity, where everything is governed by natural laws. There's no outside influence. Nature is all there is. That's a ton of assumptions in a belief system. I don't owe it to people that hold that belief system to demonstrate why I believe differently. I'm welcome to believe that actually, though the world operates in a way that science can demonstrate reliably cause and effect, that doesn't necessarily mean that cause and effect is constitutive of all of the world. God is fully present in the world in ways that science is not able to understand. I am completely justified in holding that belief, and I can still make sense of some of the data. Now, if I just ignore gravity or something like that, that's going to probably call into question the coherence of what I'm trying to say. But I don't have to come onto the playing field of naturalism in order to make my claim.
Okay, so Reformed epistemology. So what about radical orthodoxy, postmodernity?
I'm doing these two together. They're two separate things, but for Smith, they come together. And in some ways, it's taking what I just said and that same concept, but it's applying that to a community. And meaning, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, rather than the church trying to correlate how it fits into society, the church should be its own thing. And so the church's job is not to fit in. The church's job is to be the church within the commitments of the church, the language of the church, the practice of the church. And the prophetic witness is our lived behavior as the church. It's not necessarily our ability to win an argument in the secular square. And so if you kind of take the Volk Church idea where it's in a way the church is the chaplain of the culture, this is the opposite of that. Or if you take the concept of Christendom, this is the opposite of that, where really what the church is, it's an embassy of the kingdom of heaven that lives according to its own rules, its own commitments, its own standards and ways of living. And the very act of being the church becomes its witness to the world.
And that's radical orthodoxy.
That's radical orthodoxy. Yeah. Where that ties in with postmodernity is what postmodernity is going to highlight is that there's not this view from nowhere. There's not this neutral, common sense belief that dictates the way the world works. Instead, what there are communities, and there's systems of thought, and there's ways of expressing, and that's tied up in language, that's tied up in cultural practice, ritual, all that kind of stuff. But there's really no way to evaluate one or the other. So who's to say that the secular, and we're going to define that with Taylor here in a little bit, the secular belief system of modern America over and against, a Catholic country over and against an Islamic country over, whatever other belief systems are out there, all of those are legitimate ways of understanding and viewing the world. There's really no way to judge between them because they all live on their own terms. Now, a true postmodern would actually say, and there's really no way to ever know truth. There's no referent. I don't think Smith goes there. I don't think Taylor goes there. They are saying there's some kind of correspondence with reality. But what they're also really advocating against, and I've mentioned this before, but sometimes in analyzing somebody, I like to know who they're arguing with. And who both Taylor and Smith are arguing with are people who are saying there is this neutral belief system in the world, that this is kind of the default. And then you have these religious groups that come along, but really there's this neutral thread that is not religious. It's not an active belief system. It's just kind of the way things are in this neutral secular space. They're saying, no, that's not how it is. They're saying everything's an active belief system. And therefore, if we are Christian, we have the opportunity to develop our own active belief system in our own community according to our own rules that are lived out in the concept of the church. It's not just this ghettoized version of it. I mean, they're very nuanced, and you can see really quickly what the critique could be with some of these kind of thoughts. You're like, well, what about astrologers? So who's to argue if you say that, astrology dictates the way that the world works and who you are, and it's warranted, and you have a community of people, and that's just your way of looking at the world. Like, how can we even have a conversation? There's a lot more sophistication in these arguments than that, but I'm just giving the simple version of kind of what they're seeing here is, rather than starting with, I have to prove to you why I belong at the big boy table and what I'm trying to say, I'm actually saying within my own community, I want to analyze and look at my own concepts and the internal logic of the Christian community and the internal witness of the Christian community as my starting place. And then, we can maybe have some dialogue, but it's from within, not in this attempt to fuse it all together.
Mm-hmm. But not postmodern necessarily in the eradication of like capital T truth.
Yeah, there's different forms of postmodern. I mean, you definitely can get to the point where everything is relative for people.
For Smith in particular.
I in my reading of Smith, I would be interested to see how far he takes that. I think he would probably go pretty far, and maybe even further than me probably in what can we know of truth versus how do we align ourselves with the community. That would be a very postmodern line of thinking, is the best I can do to attach myself to the inner logic of a community, and that's the only truth I can know, or is there a referent beyond that? I would advocate for the referent beyond that, and that's, I'll bring this in at some point, divine action and God's action in the world. I think Smith would agree to some extent, but I think he would probably go further than I would on how much truth can we actually know.
That's great. Okay, so he holds a more reformed epistemology, this radical orthodoxy, this kind of postmodern approach to truth being localized or expressed communally. What about this Pentecostal element of who he is? That's an interesting...
He actually has a great, really philosophical book that deals with epistemology called Thinking in Tongues. And it's awesome. I mean, it's a great book. And so what he's looking at, if you can kind of track the logic of what I'm saying, he really likes the Pentecostal experience of the Spirit in embodied worship. And so what he is meaning by that is that the understanding of Pentecostals is really a worldview of the experience of the Holy Spirit more than it is a theology expressed in formal propositions. So in other words, a Pentecostal would not start, in Smith's reading, it's not starting with a linear system of this is our worldview, but instead it's this default kind of background belief system that we are experiencing the power and the presence of the Holy Spirit. And what we say comes out of that experience rather than what we say leads to that experience. And so it's a different way of doing theology.
Yeah, maybe an analog being kind of in a relationship that, like, my experience of my wife starts with a lived reality, not just what I could say about her or believe
Right.
about her. That all emerges from a lived experience with a real person that transcends thought and speech.
Yeah, I think you've got it. And for Smith, it's communal and it's also embodied, and those two things are both really important for him. And so we're not these brains in a vat that logically think, but there's a realness to the community that we inhabit where we have these communal experiences together. And the significance of tongues is we don't actually have words for it. And so that's the power of it is there is something about tongues that is precognitive or acognitive. Like it's not something that our brains are generating, but it's an experience that we're having of the Spirit that bypasses or transcends at least our cognitive abilities that then has tangible effect. So it's something that occurs, in our worship. We're moving, that's whole body and the way that it's being expressed. And so it's this kind of embedded social practice that Pentecostals carry. And it's not something that we can actually name very easily or point to very easily. He has this great quote in his book, Thinking on Tongues. We might say that carried in the practices of Pentecostal worship is a precognitive understanding that constitutes a Pentecostal social imaginary. Now, that phrase social imaginary is Charles Taylor. And so, after you might want to come back to that quote at the end of our book review, it'll make more sense. But what's coming to that is he's saying it's not that Pentecostals have a defined worldview of the Spirit's work and how we experience the Spirit, in a formal epistemological setting that's up and against philosophy. I mean, Smith does, but the vast majority of Pentecostals don't. But instead what we have is a communal intuition about the work of the Spirit and God's presence in the world, where the world is sacramental, infused with the Spirit, where we expect God to show up and speak and move among a community in a way that's going to be holistic and affecting every element of us. And that actually in and of itself then is something that is epistemological. It is like it's or maybe even more than that. It's meaning making of how I understand the world. And so what it's doing is I'm actually giving the world a different meaning than if I am doing, this analytic philosophy in the Western tradition where I'm cognitively analyzing the world. It's a very different way of even approaching how the world operates and works. And I think that's what Smith sees in that. One thing that this is Smith's language, and I think he got it from John Milbank, who is the key figure with radical orthodoxy, is he refers to postmodernity as hypermodernity. And so what Smith's looking for is, what's a way out of modernity? I mean, he's very critical of modernity in a lot of ways. But what commonly goes of postmodernity doesn't really transcend modernity because it's still a cognitive way of understanding the world predicated on human reason. So
propositions.
Yeah, modernity in its original is more positive in reason's ability to understand the world. Postmodernity is a negative appraisal of human reason, of we can't really understand the world, but neither of them are able to transcend the primacy of reason. So it's a positive or a negative reaction to reason, but reason is still centered. So I think there's something about radical orthodoxy, Pentecostalism. These are ways that are not starting with reason, but they're starting with something else, which then opens up some possibilities beyond kind of this prison of modernity that I think he's wanting to escape.
Mm-hmm. There's another quote you have here. Is this from Thinking in Tongues also? Is this in particular?
Yeah, you can read that one.
Yeah, this is a great quote that I feel like summarizes that thought. In particular, I want to suggest that at work here is a kind of proto-postmodern intuition about knowledge, kind of going back to that commentary on epistemology, that constitutes a performance critique of modern criteria for knowledge, a Pentecostal critique of the rationalism that characterizes modern accounts of knowledge.
Yeah.
Mouthful, but it's a summary of what
it's a great quote.
Kind of blending those comments on epistemology and the Pentecostalism, that there's this, I'm trying to put it in my own words, but like an experiential, intuitive understanding of truth or the divine or God that transcends just the rational, propositional way that we come to know things in the West, typically, where we can apply, a methodology to examining something.
The struggle, pardon me, the struggle even with your ability or my ability to tightly define it is exactly the purpose of this book we're about to read. And so I'm going to get into that in a second with plausibility structures. because part of the problem is we are so trained to only think through the lens of modernity that we actually have a hard time coming up with language to think beyond that. And so that's part of what he's getting at here with the Pentecostal experience is the way that Pentecostals arrive at the knowledge of God is actually very different. It came out of a lived experience in the context of the church. And at least from me, that was a tangible encounter with the Holy Spirit. Somebody else could come along and maybe deny that part. But either way, what you can't deny is they actually arrived at knowledge via a different means than modernity. Now, there are some Pentecostal scholars who actually try to tie Pentecostalism and modernity a lot closer together, or even as a reaction to modernity. So this is not a undisputed point that Smith is making, but I find it compelling nonetheless.
Okay, so kind of that last point then, talking about the liturgy, he is liturgical. What do you mean by that?
Probably his most famous book is a book called Desiring the Kingdom. And what he's doing is he's taking very seriously the formative power of a community. And he's the one who, you guys, if you've listened for a while, have heard me reference what he calls the liturgy of the shopping mall. So it's a dated example, but his point is that all of life is formative. And so when I go shopping, that's actually a formative experience, just like the liturgy that I go to is formative. And so what he's challenging, and you can see the thread of his thought through all these different things. What he's challenging is that the church experience is an embodied experience that's forming us. It's not just the sermon. And I think that might be one of his main things that he's really going after is if you think that you're going to present a logical sermon that proves something in 30 minutes, when the majority of somebody's life is lived in an emotive, formative world that's even giving meaning to the possibilities of world. And a lot of that's based in consumer culture and a powerful social imaginary that we inhabit and all that kind of stuff. We're just kidding ourselves. The power of a sermon or even like logical apologetics. And it's not that those things are bad. I think he's just trying to demonstrate to us that those things alone aren't going to carry the day. The church itself needs to have formative power, and that's in our liturgy. So for him, he's actually going after traditional liturgy because he's like, we're reliving, retelling the story of who we are as believers, and that has formative power. Now, I would probably see his point and up the ante by saying liturgy or not, 45 minutes, an hour, hour and a half on a Sunday morning is not going to be enough. And so that the church is actually a lived community that goes beyond a Sunday morning worship experience that needs to have dynamic formative power. But I agree with that point that he's trying to make as far as awareness of the formative power of church. And then for us, a sensitivity to what we do. Liturgy is a very broad term for what we do as church, what we do as believers, of recognizing it's not just the worship songs or the sermons that's formative, but it's all of our practices are formative. And are we just blindly following the ways of the world, or is our formative practice leading people or pointing people towards the kingdom of God and making space for the Spirit of God? And so I think that's an important critique that Smith would bring.
Right. So, I don't remember all the brain science, but I was thinking as you're talking about that, how advertisers don't appeal to the prefrontal cortex or, the rational part of our brains, but they appeal to the emotions, I don't know if that's the amygdala or whatever part of the brain. Actually, we were watching the national championship football game the other day, and this commercial came on. It was for some medicine. It was like some doctor sitting there actually like explaining why this medicine is good and why it functions the way it does. My kids were like, that was a terrible commercial, but it was like the most actually informative commercial I've seen in a while, but it didn't appeal to the part of the brain that they're living in more often than not. Okay. So, it is definitely obvious how much you've been shaped by Smith and Charles. So where would you pivot from here in talking about the two of them together, or Charles Taylor maybe more specifically?
Mm-hmm. So Taylor, he is Catholic and he is a Canadian philosopher. His main focus, he's one of these academics that just dabbles in a whole host of stuff, but his main focus is philosophical anthropology. Who are we as people? That's like his big deal. How do we understand? He doesn't exactly fit the camps that philosophers tend to fall into. So there's elements that are analytical, elements that are continental. You can kind of, he dabbles, he crosses a lot of boundaries. I actually saw an interview with James Smith where, he's acknowledging one of the critiques of Taylor is because he's so broad in his scope, it's impossible to be thorough if you're broad. You can't. So anything you say, if you're going to do even this book, Secular Age, I mean, it's super long. He covers a ton of ground. He talks about art. He talks about music. He talks about history. He talks about religion. He talks about philosophy. Probably, knowing the Academy, probably every single one of those things, he might say something in a sentence and someone's written a dissertation and challenged something, So he's a broad guy more than he is a niche guy that goes narrow. But his idea is philosophical anthropology. He leans heavily on phenomenology, which, if that's a new term for you, it's the study of experience and making sense of experience. And so rather than viewing the human experience and emotion and feeling about something kind of as secondary underneath logical and just the way the world works, it's actually saying that those things are really powerful because they tell us a lot about the world, and there's legitimacy to experience, not just what can be logically proven. And so you kind of start with lived experience. And so if you ever come across a phrase like the lived experience of somebody, in a way that's phenomenology, and that's, you and I could actually have two very different lived experiences of the same external stimuli or circumstances. And so a lot of what Smith is doing even in this book, or Taylor does in A Secular Age, and then Smith is calling attention to, is they're trying to capture the experience of a secular age, not just a logical overview of a secular age. And Smith gets into some of that in his intro, but that partially explains the length of it. That partially explains the style of it, is because they're going after the zeitgeist, the German word of, but it's kind of the spirit of the age, rather than thinking of themselves as these analytical, dispassionate observers of something where they can sit down from on high and look at it. And his appeal ultimately is, in a way, if you're kind of going with phenomenology, it's like, does my telling of the story fit your experience of the story? Rather than proving to you via the logic of what I'm telling you. That's a phenomenological approach. Now, where Taylor is not fully that, if you take that all the way, that's where you get into full postmodernism or some even the critical theories. He's also a bit analytical in the sense that he is saying there are universal human experiences. And so this would be the big break with postmodernity. There's really no such thing as universal human experience at one level. But for him, there is. Like he's saying there is a desire for transcendence that's universal to all people. And he's talking about certain things like that he's making this appeal beyond just the experience of a particular community. And so, he kind of goes in and out of those two things. And a lot of analytical philosophy is looking at internal logic and coherence. And where they're similar is, especially modern, a lot of it has to do these days with the language. So they're not actually saying this is how the world is, but they're looking at the logic of our language that describes the world. So I may not know how the world actually is, but I can analyze the logic of the English language or the logic of philosophy and the way that it describes the world to test and see, is this logic coherent? And that's, typically in the realm of analytical philosophy. And a lot of times that crew will demur on, is this actually the world as it is, or is this just the language we have for it? There's no way to know, but we can test at least our propositions that are formed via language.
Right. We can analyze calculus and test its propositions, but why does it exist? Like, it's a phenomenon that was just kind of plucked out of the air. Maybe a similar analog there.
So yeah, let me give a few remarks on A Secular Age. First of all, it is long. That's why we're reading the intro, which is not long. It may feel long to you, but I guarantee you it's not as long as A Secular Age. And Smith's critique, I forget if it was in his intro or something else I read, but I agree with him, and I've read a few other kind of scholarly reviews. And, kind of the standard critique is it's just kind of meandering. It's not the easiest read. It's long. He'll take long tangents. One person's review that I resonated with is it could have probably used a really thorough edit, just some repetition and some of that kind of stuff. You can just lose the plot if you're not careful, and it can be challenging to connect all the dots. So I think Smith's book really does a great service to A Secular Age because you can read it, and if somebody wants to tackle the rest of the book, you'll be a lot better for it after reading Smith first. I wish I had known that. That was one of my first real academic books to tackle, so it was kind of a baptism by fire. And it is a difficult book, like it was for me when I first read it. If you're not well-versed on the various subjects he engages, you spend a lot of time looking up names, concepts, just to make sense of what he's trying to say. So Smith talks about that, the length and then the lack of engaging the detail across the breadth of what Taylor is saying. I think those are fair critiques. I don't think they're fatal, though. I think they're just the reality at one level. And I appreciate Smith's insight into this, is to do this kind of project, you almost have to be willing to do that and open yourself to that critique. Otherwise, the project never gets done. And I think Charles Taylor does a great service by tackling this on such a meta level. So Taylor's big idea is that modern secularism, and I'm going to define that in a second, is this active belief system that emerged from within Christianity. And crucially, it didn't have to be this way. Like, it is the product of history and philosophical development that got us to this point.
It wasn't an inevitability.
It was not an inevitability, and it could have taken a different road. And in some ways, it's dependent on what came before it. So the German philosopher Hegel is going to, Hegelian philosophy is going to definitely come into play, and we'll reference that later on because that's a lot of his theories. But it's not something, and I think a lot of the common secularism narratives is like breaking off the chains of the past, or this inevitability, this almost manifest destiny of secularism, of progress in humanity, and we're kind of reaching our telos of kind of shedding superstitions over time and moving into this new moral order that's based on reason and science and a common human nature. And like Taylor is going to 100% argue, strongly critique, challenge. I mean, he's going after that idea in a very significant way, rather than seeing this, like all other things, as modern secularism is an evolutionary process of development that occurred within different belief systems and kind of adds new features to it over time. And really a lot of it was entirely within Christianity, and most of its formation was within Christianity, but then eventually developed the resources that led it to expand out from Christianity. But it's a belief system that is a product of time and culture, and it doesn't have this manifest destiny. It's not inevitable. It's not neutral. It's something that is developing in the world. And this gets into one of his concepts, and this is what he's arguing against, is a subtraction theory. And you'll come across this in Smith's book, you'll come across this in Taylor's book, and it's really where he starts the secular age, he is arguing against subtraction theories. And a subtraction theory is essentially saying that now that we have science, now that we have philosophy, that gradually religion is fading into the background. And so it's a lot of these like evolutionary theories of religion. We used to need this, but we don't need it anymore. We used to need religion because we didn't have a way of explaining the world, but now that we have science, we don't need religion anymore. Like, those are all subtraction theories that are trying to make sense of the world. So Smith or Taylor is arguing against subtraction theories. He's saying this isn't just a thing where we gradually lost the need for it. Instead, this is a new religion that came along where people are converting out of it. And that's what he is kind of positing, and I think makes an incredibly compelling case for how that could be.
So you kind of highlight three critical concepts when it comes to understanding secularism, at least in this context. So what would those concepts be as kind of, an intro to this whole work?
Yeah, I'll be brief on these because really we're reading the book to uncover them. First is Charles Taylor presents three forms of secularism: secularism 1, 2, and 3.
It's very creative.
I know it is. It's like secularism, then like a little subscript 1. Like, wow, this is
leave it up to an academic.
Yeah, exactly. Well, part of why he's doing that is he's showing that we equivocate in our use of the term. And so he's highlighting this term is getting used in 3 different ways. And so I can actually have a conversation with you, and you can use secularism and mean something different than I mean by it.
Yeah, and for those of you listeners who like etymology, secular actually it was a Latin. Do you know what the Latin was?
I don't know.
So it actually meant age, like an age or a generation.
Oh, interesting.
So it's funny, a secular age is kind of a redundancy, but then it morphed into meaning more generally the world, as maybe over and against the church. And then onto its modern uses.
And that gets into Taylor's first secularism 1 is the separation of church and state. So that's where the term first kind of pops into the imagination, and still some people use it that way, that secularism is the separation of church and state. It's secular. It's not this kind of church state, Christendom situation where there's no
a
distinction.
Foil to the spiritual.
Yeah, it's really more, it's not intended to mean anything more than we have a society where church and state are separate. Secularism 2 is really the subtraction theories, the inevitable decline of religion and modernity, that almost that like science and modernity is displacing the possibility of religion. And that would be how it's used in a lot of settings as well. Secularism 3 is actually over and against those first two options, that it's really the explosion of options available to someone. And this is when I talk about secularism as a religion, I'm saying secularism 3 as a religion. So it's very much focused on expressive individualism. It's very much focused on that the world has been created in such a way that I can create my own meaning of the world. And why it's secularism is I'm not dependent on some other authority. So because there's not some other authority, I am free to make my own decision about how the world operates, what the world means. I am this individual in the world that can then decide what that world is or what God is. And if I want to be Buddhist one day, I can be Buddhist one day. If I want to be Christian another day, I can be Christian another day. I can, and it's the potential to believe a lot of different things and make my own meaning. And that's what he's getting into with secularism 3. He calls it the nova. It's like this exploding nova of options. And what he's pointing out is that actually historically is an anomaly. Most people, what you were capable of believing is not just like it wasn't an option in the sense the government wouldn't let you, but you would not have been able to imagine other options. And that's what makes our age so unique, is I'm exposed to so many different ways of believing, and it's so normal in our culture for us to have different ways and even changing the ways that we believe, rather than I'm living in a world that's already been made for me, and I can't really think outside of that world. That's the distinctive thing he's highlighting with secularism 3. And his point is we can't undo it. So even the most wholehearted believer, still, he talks about fragility, and it's going to come into play later. It's fragile in the sense that I'm constantly interacting with people who live with a different understanding of the world, and I can't go back to that previous synthesis where the world was just given to me as it is. I have to contend with there's a lot of different ways of making meaning in the world.
And we talk about probably a mashup of secularism 2 and 3 most in this podcast. This obviously, I would say probably most secularism 3, just this explosion of options. But also, and we talked about this just last episode, this decline of religion and modernity and kind of the materialistic scientism that could be thought of as a more secular way of secular belief system. Okay, so that's critical concept number 1. Those kind of 3 subscripts: secularism 1, 2, and 3. What would be concept number 2?
Concept 2 is plausibility structure. And there's a really neat, tight quote that Smith gives defining this as what you believe versus what is believable. So what you believe could be any number of things, but plausibility structure is not what you believe, what you are consciously able to articulate as your belief. Plausibility structure is what is actually believable to you based on the world that you live within. And this is closely tied to social imaginary, which is another term. But it's the limits of your imagination based on the culture that you inhabit. So that's critical, and that runs throughout this book. Is he's a lot more interested not in the things that you have consciously or cognitively analyzed. He's a lot more interested in the things you've never analyzed, because that sets the limits of what you're even able to believe. Mm-hmm. Third concept is what he calls the immanent frame. And I think I could, my simplistic definition of this would be that this world is all there is. That what matters in the world is not a transcendent eternity that all of us are moving into, but what matters in the world is human flourishing in the here and now, and all I can know in this world is what I have in front of me, and that's all there really is. I was thinking about this concept. I find this kind of ties into plausibility structure as well, but I love reading and watching old British detective series, and it's such a great. They're fun to read, but also it's a great.
Don't we all?
Yeah, Sherlock Holmes, Agatha Christie. The theme in all of them are there's these modern detectives, and they're not swayed at all by superstition, by belief, by myth, by anything. Only the cold, hard logic that leads them to the facts. And a lot of times, like half of the stories, it seems like there's always some kind of supernatural element, and a lot of these are written in kind of the Victorian era, which was, obsessed with that kind of supernatural element. But in the end, the detective is able to see through that down to the cold, hard reason of the world and all that there is in the world. And my wife and I, we love this one. Perot is one of her characters, and there's this BBC dramatized series about him, which is fun. But there's one episode where there's this curse, like this Egyptian curse, and it's all spooky, and it's like filmed in the 90s, so it's pretty hokey as well. But there's this curse, and there's this dialogue scene where, they're asking this detective, these doctors are asking him, like, you can't really believe in the curse, can you? And he answers, well, I can. and they kind of press him on it. And what he believes in is not that there is actually a supernatural curse, but the ability of the curse to impact how people believe in the here and now. And I think that really captures it. It's like, I believe in the curse, not because I believe in anything spiritual, but I believe that if people believe there's a curse, that it can actually motivate human behavior. And so in that sense, the curse is real. But it's still fully in an immanent frame. It's fully in a world of closed cause and effect, where all that matters is humanity and the meaning we give to it. And you can't really think beyond that. I thought that that captures the essence of that in a neat way.
So this episode today, just teeing up the intro to How Not to Be Secular, talking about kind of these three critical concepts. You talked about how Smith is giving an overview of a secular age. Charles Taylor talked about Smith himself. What would you say, just to kind of wrap this up, a summary of the intro? Sounds funny. But just to help our listeners, wade into this work a little bit.
Yeah, I think a few things that struck me. I mean, first, Taylor and Smith have both certainly influenced my own thinking. I do have some differences, and I think where I find myself with Smith probably diverging the most would be that whole idea of, postmodern dialogue, what feels real to you, where I'll typically point a little more to, like, yes, I agree with a lot of that postmodern critique, but I'm also saying there is something tangible and real about God breaking into the world. And I don't think Smith would disagree with that in any way. I want to be really fair to him. I've obviously gleaned heavily from him, but in my analysis, I'll lean a little more heavily on that, whereas he might lean a little more heavily on the impact and the experience of what's felt in the community. And some of that is not necessarily what you believe, but it's how you choose to engage the dialogue. And so how he chooses to engage the dialogue is a lot more based on what feels right and feels real, where I think that's relevant in this conversation, but maybe not. I don't tend to go quite as far with it. Now, what stood out to me more than anything was this book is already a bit dated, but how relevant it is.
Yeah.
He's writing and he's actually talking about Secularism 3, and he's making these statements like, well, right now it's just limited to a few areas. And I'm just thinking, what he is saying is no longer true. Like right now, we've reached a cultural tipping point where it's way more dominant. And so, 13 years old, and you already can feel that.
Yeah, that's crazy.
He also, in the intro, not so much in the rest of the book, there's a style choice of, I remember this era where he's not at all like emergent church. I think he would like very heavily critique that. But there's a style of writing, of this engagement with pop culture reference. And I don't even know how to describe it. Like if you've read books from that era, you know what I'm talking about. So in the intro, he picks up on some of that. That's not really my thing, but don't worry. Like that's just, I think he's just trying to make it accessible for somebody.
You drip pop culture, Drew.
I'm all for, I don't even know how to put words to it. It's like you read it, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's very clearly what he's trying to do here is he's trying to find somebody who's wrestling with faith and meet them on their own. So I deeply appreciate his heart. Smith is a brilliant writer and has a lot of different types of prose, which I think is really cool. Like he can be very technical. He can also be very accessible. So he's obviously a very skilled writer. It's just the intro, I got into it and I had some walls go up based on some of what he was doing. And then once I got past a few things, I was like, all right. And a lot of it for him is, he looks a lot at the role of art. Part of why he's doing it, and he's following Charles Taylor, is he's not just trying to capture logic, but feel. So he's like quoting songs and poetry and authors. It's just all stuff that's like at least 13 years old. So that's part of what makes it feel a little bit dated. Some of it's a bit crass, so I warn you in advance. And he's doing it on purpose because he's trying to capture the limitations and the feeling of an age and be a bit provocative. But he's doing it on purpose. But just fair warning what he's doing there. However, despite all of that, it is wild how relevant it is. And as I was going through it, I just thought, man, this is, I think an important way of capturing the world. Okay, we'll leave it at that. So we'll put out on social media. So make sure you follow us on Instagram if you want to follow along. And we'll put out the book, the reading times and the chapter summaries and all that type of stuff.
Yeah, and that's that's at Ideology PC is Instagram and YouTube. You can catch us there. And again, this whole endeavor doing this book study is so that we can live faithfully as followers of Jesus in this secular age. And so hopefully this is a fruitful endeavor for you, a thought-provoking study, and we look forward to doing it communally. Thank you for tuning in. We'll catch you next time on Ideology.